Hello everyone. So in this video, I will show how you can create a custom authentication in Spring Boot application using Interceptor. The approach that we'll be using is basically to allow you to share some data from your handler, some metadata from your handler into an interceptor. Otherwise, generally what happens, we try to populate the data in interceptor and use them in our handler. But to allow an authorization on an API level, we need to do a reverse. For example, we want to define certain scope on our handler, HTTP handler, and somehow get those scope that we have defined onto the interceptor, right? So let's start with that. So this is a blog that I have written. So you guys can go on this blog, adesigner.in, and get all the codes that I'll be showing. Right? So to start, let's uh, download our sample project from start.spring.io. Right? So I'll be using Maven, Java, will be using 3.4.1 Spring Boot version. You can use even lower version, not an issue. This will be our group. We will say custom auth z, right? And let's keep the description as it is. We'll be leveraging Java version 70, sorry. And on dependency, because we want to create an RESTful API, we'll be using Spring Web. You can explore some other library as well here. Let's do that. Generate, and this is downloaded. So let me open this, right? So this is the file, custom auth. Now let me open this in our Eclipse. Let's click on import Maven, existing Maven project. Click on next. Here we'll go to downloads, custom auth, open, and this has identified one project, form.xml. So we'll import that. And as you can see here, this is has have been identified as a Maven project. Now, now application is up. Now what we want to start with is create a custom controller. So for this video, what I'll do is I will create everything in the same package. But for good practice, you should create a separate package for each of your entity that you will be creating, right? So let's create ping controller, and to register this with our Spring Boot, we will create REST controller, and let me define a method. Let's call ping, right? And let's return form as a. Now, if I'll run this application, let me run it. So what I'll do is I'll click here, run as Java application. That should be our custom auth. So I have another application which is utilizing this port. So that's why this is giving an error. Let me stop that for a moment. Or what we can do is we can change the port. We can run this application on 8081. Okay. And to find out all the configuration for Spring, what you can do is you can just go to Google and search for how to change from cat server port in Spring Boot application. And as you can see, you can use this particular configuration in your application.properties file. So let me just copy this and we'll go to our Eclipse. Here it is. Now let's run the application again. Now, as you can see, uh, Tomcat picked this particular port to run our server 8081. Now let's try to access. So on this controller, we have not defined any path how we want to access this particular handler. So what we can do is we can add that get mapping. Let's call it ping. Now if I come here, let me restart this as well. Now let's come here and try to access. As you can see, I'm able to access this particular API. But let's say somehow if this is a very secured API and we want not everyone to access this API, what we can do is we can create an interceptor which will intercept every request and see the scope that we have defined, a scope, a role, anything that you might want to call it. And then in that interceptor, we can validate whether the current user have access to that scope or not, right? So to do that, what we'll have to do is we'll have to create an interceptor first, which will intercept this request. So let's create an interceptor. We'll call that auth z interceptor. And this will implement our handler interceptor, right? And now, because authorization happens before our handler is called and executed, so we will override the pre method, pre handle method, right? Now, here somehow we want to validate. Let's write handle authorization. Now, every request will go through here. Now, somehow we want to pass a metadata that if user have a particular scope, for example, let's say they have scope of, let's say, uh, ping.get, then only they can uh, access this particular API. Otherwise, we will throw a 403 error, right? So to do this, to basically pass this information that this particular API needs this scope, what we can do is we can go to this handler, right? Let's create an uh, first. What we'll do is we will create an custom interface which will store this data, and then we will read that interface in our interceptor and make a decision based on that. So before we do that, what we'll have to do is we'll also have to uh, add this interceptor in Spring pipeline, because as you can see, this is not a component or anything. So this will not be automatically registered with Spring Boot. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to create, let's call it web config, and this will basically implement web MVC configurer, right? And here we want to override one method, which is add interceptors. So let's check that. Let's remove this part. Now in registry dot add interceptor new. So we want to add our auth interceptor. Now what will happen? Every request will go through this auth interceptor, and here now we will write our main logic, right? Now to continue, what we want to do is we want to create an interface. So let's call, or we can, there is in Eclipse, there is also a type called annotation, right? So let's do that. And we will call auth z scope. You can give any name you want to give, right? And as you can see, this is of type interface. Now what we want to define, the data that we want to store is called scope, right? Array of scope that user has. And the target for this particular interface would be a method and type, right? Element type dot method. And let's also give this to element type dot type. We'll close this. And the retention that we want to add, let's import this target as well. Retention. And we want to apply the retention at runtime. Retention policy dot runtime. Now, to define the scope on our handler, we'll go here. Now, rather than this scope, what we'll have is, so the new interface that we have created, right? And here we want to set this scope as ping.get, right? Now, to read this data in our handler, in our interceptor, what we will do is we will first convert this handler object to our handler method object, right? So first what we'll have to do is we'll have to check whether this handler is an instance of handler method. Okay. Once we are sure, then what we can do is we can just lots of typo. So this here should be handler. right? Now we want to get this scope. So get method annotation, right? And here we just have to pass the annotation that we want to read. And let's store this scope annotation, right? Now what we can do is we can just check if this thing is null or not, because there would be some APIs on which we would not define this annotation. So to make sure of that, we can do this. And now we can get our scopes because we have this object, right? Now what we can do is now here we can write the logic to check whether this particular request has a header. Uh, it could be based on basic header or role, like however logic you want to implement, right? You have gotten your uh, scope that is required for this particular handler to be executed, right? Just for this example, what we'll do is we will just print out the data. Let's call scope require thing dot join. Let's join it back, right? So now if I run this application, now if I open browser and try to access this, we minimize this so we can see log. Now let's try to access. For some reason, we are not getting this. So what we can do is let's try to see first whether we are hitting this handler or not, this intercept. Now let's refresh again. As you can see, this interceptor itself is not getting called. We have so now to check that, we'll have to see what we have missed. So this is registered already, but this web MVC configurer is not registered with our Spring Boot. So that's why now we just have to register this MVC configurer with Spring Boot. Now if we run our application, let me remove this breakpoint as well. As you can see, now we are getting this result. So yeah, this is one way to get data back from handler to our interceptor. You can add more details to this. For example, if you want to add whether this particular API needs an admin access, so you can define this flag as well. And whenever you are defining this ODZ, what you'll have to do is you will have to also define admin. Let's call it false, right? You can check whether, apart from the scope, whether that particular user is of type admin or not. Then only we will allow access to this API. Otherwise, we will return from this interceptor itself, we will terminate the request and send out 401 response code. Yeah, so that's it for this video.